Lost Serpent Kings, Boring History for Sleep. A Cambodian mystery. Welcome to Ancient Whispers. Welcome to tonight's story. Dear listener, this is your invitation to drift away on the gentle currents of history, where fact and legend intertwine like morning mist over ancient temple stones. Tonight, we journey to the heart of Cambodia, to a time when gods walked among mortals and kings claimed dominion over both earth and sky. You don't need to remember every detail of what you're about to hear. In fact, I encourage you not to try. Instead, find your most comfortable position, dim the lights, and let your mind wander as freely as the Mekong River through its ancient valleys. The volume will gradually fade after 50 minutes, allowing you to slip naturally into sleep while the story continues its quiet flow around you. What if I told you that beneath the famous temples of Angkor, archaeologists have discovered chambers that predate the Khmer Empire by centuries? Where did the original builders of these underground sanctuaries disappear to? And why did they leave behind only serpentine carvings and Sanskrit inscriptions that speak of kings who never died? Who were these mysterious Naga rulers that ancient texts describe as governing from crystal palaces beneath the earth? How did an entire civilization seemingly vanish overnight, leaving behind only whispers in stone and the faint echo of temple bells that some locals claim to hear on windless nights? These questions have puzzled historians for generations, and tonight we'll explore the shadowy borderland between documented history and the mysteries that time refuses to reveal. Our story begins in the mists of pre-Angkorian Cambodia, sometime between the 1st and 6th centuries CE. The exact date remains elusive, much like everything else about this lost civilization. In this ancient land, where the mighty Mekong carved paths through primeval forests, there existed a kingdom that history books barely acknowledge, a realm ruled not by ordinary men, but by beings who claimed descent from the great serpent spirit of Hindu-Buddhist mythology. The Chinese chronicles of this period mention trade with kingdoms in what they called Funan, a powerful state that controlled the lower Mekong Delta. But Chinese records, detailed as they were about trade goods and tribute payments, speak only in passing of the political structure of these southern neighbors. They describe rulers who wore elaborate headdresses adorned with serpent motifs, and who claimed their authority derived from underwater palaces hidden beneath sacred lakes. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of a sophisticated pre-Angkor civilization. Excavations in the Mekong Delta have uncovered elaborate temple foundations, intricate irrigation systems, and artifacts that suggest a complex religious and political hierarchy. Carbon dating places these structures centuries before the rise of the classical Khmer Empire, yet their architectural sophistication rivals anything built during Angkor's golden age. The most intriguing discoveries come from a site near the modern village of Panam Da, where French archaeologists in the 1920s uncovered what they initially believed to be natural caves. Closer inspection revealed these were artificially carved chambers, their walls covered in Sanskrit inscriptions and serpentine reliefs so detailed that early researchers assumed they were dealing with a much later period. However, carbon dating of organic materials found within these chambers consistently points to a much earlier date, sometime between 200 and 400 CE. What makes these chambers truly mysterious is their apparent abandonment. Unlike other archaeological sites that show gradual decline or evidence of conquest, these underground complexes appear to have been suddenly and completely vacated. Personal items remain where they were, left bronze, mirrors, ceramic vessels, even food preparation areas with cooking implements still in place. It's as if the inhabitants simply walked away one day and never returned. Local oral traditions, passed down through generations of Khmer families, speak of the Priathong dynasty, dragon kings who ruled from crystal palaces beneath the sacred waters. These stories, dismissed by early colonial scholars as mere folklore, are now receiving renewed attention from historians who recognize that oral traditions often preserve historical truths that written records overlook. According to these traditions, the Dragon Kings possessed knowledge of both the seen and unseen worlds. They could call upon the Naga spirits to control floods and droughts, and their subjects prospered under this divine protection. The capital of their kingdom was said to be neither fully above ground nor completely subterranean, but rather existed in the liminal space between earth and water, visible only to those who knew the proper rituals and offerings. The historical king Priathong, mentioned in later Khmer inscriptions, may have been a real ruler whose deeds became mythologized over time. Some scholars suggest he was a powerful chieftain who consolidated various small kingdoms in the Mekong Delta during the early centuries CE. His name, which translates roughly to Golden Sacred One, appears in several ancient texts, though always in contexts that blur the line between historical record and religious narrative. What we do know from archaeological evidence is that pre-Angkorian Cambodia was home to a remarkably sophisticated civilization. The irrigation systems discovered in the Mekong Delta demonstrate advanced engineering knowledge, with channels and reservoirs that could manage water flow across hundreds of square kilometers. The precision of these waterworks suggests a centralized authority capable of organizing massive public works. Projects exactly the kind of kingdom that could have supported a dynasty of powerful rulers. Yet questions remain. Why do so few written records survive from this period? The later Khmer Empire was prolific in its inscriptions, covering temple walls with detailed accounts of royal deeds and religious donations. If the Dragon Kings commanded such a sophisticated civilization, where are their chronicles? Some researchers suggest that the preferred writing material of this earlier period palm leaf manuscripts simply didn't survive the tropical climate. Others point to the possibility that knowledge was primarily oral, passed down through carefully guarded ritual traditions rather than written texts. The serpent symbolism that pervades these archaeological sites reflects deep religious beliefs that connected earthly rulers with cosmic forces. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, the Naga are not merely snakes, but divine beings that control water, fertility, and the boundaries between different realms of existence. A king who claimed Naga ancestry was asserting dominion over the most fundamental forces of life itself. This supernatural legitimacy would have been particularly important in the flood-prone Mekong Delta, where a ruler's ability to predict and control seasonal inundations could mean the difference between prosperity and famine for thousands of subjects. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-Angkorian rulers invested enormous resources in water management, creating artificial islands, elevated platforms, and sophisticated drainage systems that allowed permanent settlement in areas that would otherwise be uninhabitable during monsoon season. As we settle deeper into our story tonight, picture these ancient kings in their underwater palaces, surrounded by courtiers who moved as silently as fish through crystal halls. The boundaries between reality and dream were perhaps less distinct in that distant time, when gods still walked among mortals and the natural world pulsed with unseen powers. The mystery of their disappearance continues to haunt the archaeological record, a puzzle that grows more complex with each new discovery. Were they conquered by rival kingdoms, Did environmental changes force their migration to other lands? Or did they simply retreat deeper into the hidden realms they claimed to inhabit, waiting for a time when humanity would once again be ready to receive their ancient wisdom? Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander through those submerged corridors where candlelight flickers against walls carved with the forms of celestial serpents. The answers to our questions may lie just beyond the edge of consciousness, in the space where history becomes legend and legend touches something deeper than mere fact. The palace beneath the waters, the morning mist clings to the surface of Tonle Sap Lake as our story continues, carrying us deeper into the realm where water meets earth and legends take their first breath. In this gentle twilight between waking and dreaming, we return to ancient Cambodia, where the boundary between the world above and the world below was as fluid as the monsoon rivers that carved their paths through the endless green. What secrets lie beneath the sacred waters of Cambodia's Great Lake? When did the first Dragon King descend into those crystalline depths to establish his underwater court? Where along the lake's vast expanse did shamans and priestesses gather to perform the rituals that maintained the cosmic balance? Who were the serpent princes that served as intermediaries between the aquatic realm and the kingdoms of land? How did these underwater palaces sustain themselves? And what mysteries of architecture and engineering allowed them to exist beneath? The waves. According to the oral traditions preserved by riverside communities, the Great Palace of Priathong was not built in the conventional sense, but rather grew like a living thing from the lake bed itself. The walls were said to be formed from compressed water that had been blessed by generations of Naga spirits, creating a substance harder than stone, yet translucent as morning dew. Through these crystalline walls, the court could observe the underwater world in all its supernatural beauty schools of silver fish that moved in perfect formation like celestial armies, aquatic plants that sway to rhythms unheard by surface dwellers, and the ancient spirits of the lake that appeared as shifting patterns of light and shadow. French colonial records from the early 20th century include several intriguing accounts, from local fishermen who claimed to have glimpsed unusual structures beneath the lake's surface during particularly clear, dry seasons. These reports were typically dismissed as folklore, but recent sonar surveys, conducted by marine archaeologists, have identified several geometric anomalies on the lake, bottom regular shapes that appear to organized to be natural formations. The most significant of these discoveries occurred in 1987, when a joint Cambodian-French archaeological team detected what appeared to be a series of concentric circles carved into the bedrock beneath 14 meters of water and sediment. The pattern, roughly 2 kilometers in diameter, consists of 7 rings connected by radial channels that converge on a central platform. Carbon dating of shell deposits within these channels suggests human activity in the area dating back at least 1,500 years. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Chevalier, the French marine archaeologist who led the survey, noted in his report that the precision of these underwater formations far exceeded anything that could have been accomplished with the engineering tools typically attributed to early Southeast Asian civilizations. The radial channels are carved to exact depths, creating a gradient that would have efficiently managed water, flow, and pressure. Such precision suggests either far more advanced engineering knowledge than historians had previously assumed, or the involvement of natural geological processes that happen to have created remarkably ordered patterns. Local traditions provide their own explanation for these underwater structures. Village elders in the floating communities of Tonle Sap describe the 7 rings as the foundation of Priyathong's palace, each ring representing a different level of spiritual authority. The innermost circle was reserved for the Dragon King himself, while the outer rings housed his courtiers, advisors, and the various spirits that served his underwater court. The daily life of this aquatic court followed rhythms unknown to surface dwellers. According to the stories, the underwater kingdom experienced neither day nor night as we understand them, but rather periods of greater and lesser luminescence created by the movements of benevolent spirits through the palace halls. Time itself flowed differently in this realm. A single day in the underwater palace might correspond to a full season in the world above. Or conversely, years of court life might pass in what surface dwellers experienced as mere hours. Archaeological evidence for such unusual temporal phenomena is naturally difficult to establish. However, researchers have noted curious discrepancies in the carbon dating of artifacts found at different depths within the underwater formations. Materials found at the deepest levels consistently date to periods several centuries earlier than would be expected based on the stratigraphic layers above them. While conventional archaeology would attribute this to water movement and sediment displacement, some researchers have proposed more exotic explanations, involving the complex relationship between consciousness and time measurement in ritual contexts. The court of the Dragon King was said to be populated not only by human nobles, but by a vast array of supernatural beings. Naga princes served as administrators, their serpentine forms allowing them to move effortlessly through the water-filled corridors of the palace. Yaksha spirits, benevolent nature deities from Hindu-Buddhist tradition, maintained the palace. Gardens where underwater plants grew in impossible profusion, their roots drawing nourishment directly from the spiritual energy that pervaded the entire realm. The king himself was described as both fully human and something more than human. During periods of court ceremony, he would assume his human form, appearing as a tall, dignified ruler with the elaborate jewelry and silk garments appropriate to his station. But in the privacy of his innermost chambers, or when the demands of his supernatural duties required it, he would take on his true serpentine nature, his body becoming that of an immense naga whose coils could encompass the entire central platform of the palace. This dual nature was not seen as strange or frightening by his subjects, but rather as evidence of his unique qualification to rule over both earthly and spiritual realms. The Dragon King could understand the needs of farmers whose rice paddies depended on proper flood cycles, but he could also communicate with the rain spirits and negotiate with the underground rivers that fed the great lake system. The administrative structure of this underwater kingdom was said to mirror the cosmic order itself. 7 ministers served the Dragon King, each responsible for one of the fundamental forces that governed existence: water, earth, fire, air, space, consciousness, and time. These were not merely governmental positions, but spiritual offices that required their holders to maintain constant meditation and ritual practice to keep the cosmic forces in proper balance. The Minister of Water oversaw not only the practical aspects of flood control and irrigation, but also the emotional and spiritual currents that flowed through the kingdom's subjects. The Minister of Earth managed both agricultural productivity and the stability of the underground palace foundations. The Minister of Fire maintained the spiritual energy that powered the kingdom's supernatural abilities, while the Minister of Air ensured proper communication between the underwater realm and the surface world. Perhaps most mysterious were the Ministers of Space, Consciousness, and Time, whose responsibilities extended far beyond anything recognizable in conventional political systems. The Minister of Space was said to maintain the boundaries between different realms of existence, ensuring that the underwater palace remained properly connected to both the physical lake and the spiritual dimensions that sustained it. The Minister of Consciousness served as the kingdom's chief philosopher and dream interpreter, helping subjects navigate the complex relationship between waking and sleeping awareness that was necessary for life in a realm where reality itself was more fluid than in the surface world. The Minister of Time held perhaps the most crucial position, as this official was responsible for maintaining the proper relationship between the accelerated or decelerated temporal flow within the palace and the regular time experienced by surface dwellers. Mistakes in temporal coordination could have catastrophic consequences. Crops might fail if seasonal rains arrived according to palace time rather than surface time, or diplomatic missions to neighboring kingdoms might arrive decades early or late. The palace library was said to contain knowledge from civilizations that had never existed in the surface world, the collected wisdom of kingdoms that had chosen to exist entirely in underwater or underground realms, accessible only to those who had mastered the spiritual disciplines necessary for interdimensional travel. Scholars who gained access to this library could study astronomical texts that described the movements of stars visible only from underwater perspectives, or medical treatises that explained how to heal ailments that affected only beings who lived in multiple dimensions simultaneously. As our story continues to unfold in the gentle darkness around you, imagine the soft sounds of this underwater court knot, the harsh noise of surface civilization, but the subtle harmonies created by currents moving through crystal corridors, the whispered conversations of courtiers who had learned to speak without disturbing the water around them, and the distant songs of lake spirits who gathered each evening to celebrate another day of successful harmony between the seen and unseen worlds. The mystery of how such a civilization could have existed and then vanished so completely continues to puzzle researchers. No conventional archaeological evidence supports the existence of permanently inhabited underwater structures in ancient Cambodia. Yet the persistence of these traditions across multiple generations and geographic regions suggests that something significant occurred in this area during the early centuries of the Common Era. The ritual of 7 waters, the gentle sound of water flowing over ancient stones, carries us deeper into our nocturnal journey, where the mists of time, part 2, reveal ceremonies that bridged the gap between mortal kingdoms and divine realms. In the drowsy comfort of this darkened hour, let us witness the most sacred ritual of the Dragon King's ceremony, so profound that its echoes still ripple through the spiritual landscape of Cambodia today. What was the true purpose of the ritual of 7 waters that supposedly took place every 7th year in the underwater palace? When did this ceremony first begin, and what astronomical alignments guided its timing? Where were the 7 sacred springs that provided the mystical waters essential to the ritual? Who among the court possessed the knowledge necessary to perform these ancient rites? How did the ceremony supposedly renew the Dragon King's power and maintain the cosmic balance that kept both underwater and surface kingdoms in harmony? According to the fragmentary accounts preserved in palm leaf manuscripts, discovered in various Cambodian temples, the ritual of 7 waters was the cornerstone of the Dragon King's supernatural authority. This ceremony, performed once every 7 years during the convergence of specific astrological conditions, was believed to renew the cosmic covenant that allowed the underwater kingdom to exist in harmony with the natural world. The preparation for this ritual began months in advance, with specialized priests traveling to 7 different locations throughout the Mekong Delta region to collect water from springs that were each associated with a different aspect of cosmic energy. These were not ordinary springs, but sources that local tradition claimed had been blessed by the original Naga spirits who first established the underwater kingdom. The Spring of Beginning was located high in the Cardamom Mountains, where a small stream emerged from a cave decorated with naturally occurring mineral formations that resembled serpentine shapes. The water from this spring was said to carry the power of new life and fresh starts, essential for renewing the Dragon King's connection to his divine nature. The Spring of Flowing was found in the vast wetlands south of Tonle Sap, where underground rivers created artesian wells that bubbled up through meadows of floating rice. This water represented the principle of adaptation and change, allowing the kingdom to respond gracefully to shifting conditions in both the physical and spiritual realms. The Spring of Depths was hidden beneath the lake itself, accessible only to those who could hold their breath for the time it takes a lotus flower to bloom, roughly 20 minutes according to the texts. The water from this deeper spring carried the concentrated wisdom of the earth itself, the accumulated knowledge of minerals and stones that had witnessed countless ages of geological transformation. The Spring of Reflection was located in a perfectly circular pool that appeared in the forest only during certain lunar phases. The water here was so still and clear that it served as a mirror not just for physical forms but for spiritual essence. Priests who collected from this spring had to undergo purification rituals lasting 49 days, ensuring that what reflected in the sacred pool would be worthy of inclusion in the ceremony. The Spring of Transformation was the most dangerous to access, emerging from deep cave systems that required travelers to navigate through underground passages flooded with water. The priests who made this journey often reported visions and supernatural encounters, suggesting that the caves themselves served as gateways between different realms of existence. The water collected here was essential for the portions of the ritual that dealt with the Dragon King's ability to change forms. The Spring of Unity was located at the precise geographical center of the kingdom's territory, determined not by surface measurements but by underground water table calculations that required sophisticated knowledge of hydraulic engineering. This spring's water was said to harmonize all the other collected waters, creating a unified force that could support the complex energetic requirements of the ceremony. Finally, the Spring of Return was found at a location that changed with each performance of the ritual. The priests responsible for finding this 7th spring had to rely on dreams, meditation, and careful observation of bird migration patterns to locate it. This spring represented the principle that all things must eventually return to their source, and its water completed the circle of cosmic forces represented in the ceremony. The actual performance of the ritual of 7 waters took place in the deepest chamber of the underwater palace, a spherical room whose walls were carved with intricate mandalas that depicted the relationship between different levels of existence. The chamber was accessible only through a vertical shaft that required participants to descend through 49 meters of water, breathing through hollow reeds that were blessed by temple priests and could supposedly provide unlimited air to those whose intentions were pure. Archaeological divers exploring the underwater formations beneath Tonle Sap have reported discovering what might be this ceremonial chamber. In 1994, a team led by Dr. Samrat Pitch of the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh documented a spherical cavity in the bedrock, approximately 12 meters in diameter, with walls covered in reliefs that match descriptions from the palm leaf manuscripts. However, The chamber was filled with sediment and showed no evidence of human occupation, leading researchers to classify it as a natural formation with coincidentally symbolic decorations created by mineral deposits. The ceremony itself began at sunset on the appointed day, with the Dragon King and his 7 ministers entering the chamber while court musicians played instruments carved from rare woods and stones found only in the deepest parts of the lake. The music was designed not for human ears, but to resonate at frequencies that would attract the attention of supernatural beings, whose participation was essential for the ritual's success. Each of the 7 waters was contained in vessels made from different materials: gold for the spring of beginning, silver for the spring of flowing, crystal for the spring of depths, and so forth. The vessels themselves were considered sacred objects, passed down through generations of ritual specialists and inscribed with mantras in languages that predated known Sanskrit and Pali texts. The Dragon King would drink from each vessel in a precisely determined sequence, pausing between each one to perform specific mudras and recite invocations that had been memorized rather than written, to preserve their power from being diluted by casual study. As he consumed each sacred water, witnesses reported that his appearance would subtly change, as if the different energies were gradually transforming him from his human form toward his true nature as a cosmic serpent. The most dramatic moment of the ceremony came when the king drank from the 7th vessel, containing water from the spring of return. According to accounts, this was when his transformation became complete, his human form dissolving into that of an immense naga whose coils filled the entire ceremonial chamber. In this form, he could commune directly with the underground spirits that maintained the foundations of his kingdom and negotiate the terms of cosmic balance for the coming 7-year cycle. The conversations that took place during this phase of the ritual were never recorded, as they occurred in languages that existed only in the supernatural realm. However, court interpreters who possessed psychic abilities would later provide general summaries of the negotiations. Typically, these involved agreements about seasonal flooding patterns, the movement of fish populations that sustained the kingdom's economy, and the spiritual protection that would be extended to human subjects who honored the proper rituals and maintained harmony with nature. The ceremony concluded with the Dragon King's gradual return to human form, a process that required careful attention to maintain the proper balance between his dual natures. If the transformation was not managed correctly, the king risked becoming permanently trapped in his serpent form, unable to fulfill his human responsibilities, or conversely, losing his supernatural abilities entirely. The effects of a successful ritual were said to be visible throughout the kingdom for months afterward. Crops would grow with unusual vigor, the lake would teem with fish, and the weather patterns would follow beneficial cycles that supported both agriculture and trade. Perhaps most importantly, the boundary between the underwater palace and the surface world would become more permeable, allowing for increased communication and cooperation between the human and supernatural populations of the realm. Modern hydrologists studying the historical flood patterns of the Mekong River system have noted curious regularities in 7-year cycles that seem to correlate with the traditional timing of the ritual of 7 waters. Dr. Marie Chen of the University of Lyon, who has spent decades analyzing Southeast Asian monsoon data, published a paper in 2003 suggesting that ancient Cambodian rulers may have developed sophisticated methods for predicting long-term weather patterns, possibly explaining the apparent success of their agricultural policies. As our story flows onward like the eternal currents of the Great Lake, Imagine the profound silence that must have filled the ceremonial chamber after the completion of each ritual. Silence, not empty, but full of potential, charged with the spiritual energy that would sustain an entire kingdom for 7 years. The mystery of how such ceremonies could actually influence natural phenomena continues to intrigue researchers who study the intersection of consciousness, ritual practice, and environmental systems. The disappearance of Prince Naga Senin, the hushed stillness of this late hour, as sleep beckons like a gentle tide. Our story turns to one of the most perplexing mysteries in the chronicles of the Dragon Kings, the sudden vanishing of Prince Naga Senin, heir to the underwater throne and master of the ancient arts that bound together the realms of water and earth. Let the soft rhythm of your breathing carry you deeper into this tale of loss and searching that has puzzled scholars for generations. What circumstances led to the disappearance of the crown prince during what should have been a routine diplomatic mission to the surface world? When exactly did Prince Nagasena vanish? And why do the timeline accounts from different sources contradict each other so dramatically? Where was the young prince last seen, and what significance might that location hold in understanding his fate? Who were the mysterious companions that accompanied him on his final journey, and why have their identities remained hidden in the palace records? How did an individual trained in supernatural arts of transformation and interdimensional travel simply vanish without leaving any trace that even the most skilled courtiers could follow? The story begins during the reign of Dragon King Priya Thong VII, approximately 300 years after the establishment of the underwater kingdom. By this time, the palace beneath Tonle Sap had grown into a magnificent complex of crystal chambers and flowing corridors that housed not only the royal family but an extensive court of ministers, scholars, artists, and spiritual practitioners who had dedicated their lives to maintaining the delicate balance between the seen and unseen worlds. Prince Nagasena was born during an auspicious alignment of water planet's celestial event that occurred only once every 400 years, according to the astronomical calculations preserved in the palace archives. The court astrologers proclaimed that this timing marked him as a bridge builder, destined to expand the kingdom's influence by creating new connections between previously separate realms of existence. From childhood, he displayed abilities that amazed even the experienced practitioners of the supernatural arts who served as his tutors. Unlike his father and previous Dragon Kings, who required the formal ritual transformation to shift between human and serpent forms, Prince Nagasena could change his appearance as easily as breathing. Palace records describe him appearing as a young human nobleman during morning court sessions, then transforming into his serpentine nature to spend afternoons swimming in the deepest chambers of the palace, communicating with the ancient spirits that dwelt in the underground rivers feeding the lake system. The prince's education encompassed not only the traditional skills expected of royal heirs, statecraft, military strategy, the performance of essential rituals, but also exotic disciplines that few members of the court fully understood. He studied with masters of temporal manipulation, learning to slow or accelerate his personal experience of time so that he could live through years of study in what others experienced as days. He trained in dimensional navigation, developing the ability to perceive and travel between different layers of reality that existed simultaneously in the same physical space. Most remarkably, Prince Nagasena mastered the art of consciousness projection, allowing his awareness to explore distant locations while his physical body remained safely in the palace. This skill proved invaluable for gathering intelligence about surface kingdoms and monitoring potential threats to the underwater realm. palace chronicles describe him providing detailed reports about events occurring hundreds of kilometers away. Information that was later confirmed by conventional messengers who required weeks to travel the same distances. The prince's diplomatic mission to the surface world was planned as a routine affair, part of the regular cycle of negotiations that maintained peaceful relations between the underwater kingdom and the various human rulers who controlled territory around the Great Lake. These diplomatic contacts were essential for ensuring that surface activities, particularly the construction of temples and irrigation projects, would not interfere with the delicate spiritual mechanisms that sustained the underwater palace. According to the mission briefings preserved in palace archives, Prince Nagasena was to meet with representatives of 3 surface kingdoms to renew trade agreements and coordinate flood control measures for the upcoming monsoon season. The locations for these meetings were carefully chosen neutral sites, temple complexes, where the spiritual atmosphere would provide protection for supernatural beings, like the prince, who were vulnerable to certain forms of human psychic energy. The prince departed the palace on the night of the new moon, accompanied by a small retinue of courtiers who had been specially trained for surface world interactions. These companions were chosen not for their political skills, but for their ability to maintain psychic barriers that would shield the prince from the chaotic mental energy generated by large human populations. Palace records identify them only by their court titles: the Keeper of Silent Spaces, the Guardian of Hidden Thoughts, and the Master of Veiled Intentions, suggesting that their true identities were protected by secrecy protocols that have never been fully explained. The first 2 diplomatic meetings proceeded exactly according to plan. Temple records from Wat Phra Vihir, confirmed by stone inscriptions that still exist today, document successful negotiations between Prince Nagasena and representatives of the northern kingdom of Chenla. The prince appeared in his human form, distinguished by his unusual height and the subtle luminescence that surrounded him, a common characteristic of beings who spent most of their time in the spiritually charged environment of the underwater palace. The negotiations at the second location, a temple complex near the present-day city of Kampong Tom, were also completed successfully. Here, the prince met with Southern Kingdom representatives to establish new protocols for managing the annual fish migrations that were essential to both the underwater kingdom's economy and the protein needs of surface populations. Local chronicles described the prince as soft-spoken but remarkably knowledgeable about hydraulic engineering and fish behavior, providing solutions to problems that had puzzled surface engineers for generations. The third meeting was scheduled to take place at a remote temple near the eastern shore of Tonle Sap, at a location that modern archaeologists have been unable to definitively identify. This temple was said to be dedicated to hybrid deities who represented the harmony between water and earth elements, making it an appropriate venue for negotiations between underwater and surface kingdoms. The specific temple chosen for this meeting had additional significance as a site where the boundary between different realms of existence was naturally thin, allowing supernatural beings to manifest more safely in the physical world. Prince Nagasena and his companions arrived at the designated temple complex on schedule, as confirmed by the temple priests who had been expecting them. The negotiations with the Eastern Kingdom representatives began normally, focusing on technical details of seasonal water management and ceremonial exchanges that maintained spiritual balance between the realms. However, something went wrong during the second day of negotiations. Temple records become fragmentary at this point, with some accounts suggesting that unexpected visitors arrived at the temple, individuals who were not part of the planned diplomatic meeting. Other sources hint at supernatural phenomena that disrupted the carefully maintained spiritual atmosphere of the negotiation site. The most detailed account comes from a temple priest who claimed to have witnessed the final moments before the prince's disappearance. According to this source, Prince Naga Sena excused himself from the negotiations to perform evening prayers in a private shrine room. When he failed to return after several hours, his companions went to investigate and found the shrine empty, except for a small pool of water that had not been there earlier. The water was perfectly clear, but seemed to glow with an inner light. And when the companions attempted to investigate further, the pool vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Search efforts began immediately, with both the prince's supernatural companions and the temple priests using various divination methods to locate him. The Keeper of Silent Spaces reported that the prince's psychic signature had simply ceased to exist, as if he had been completely removed from this dimension. The Guardian of Hidden Thoughts found no trace of the prince's consciousness in any of the nearby spiritual realms that they were trained to monitor. Most puzzling of all, the Master of Veiled Intentions discovered that something was actively blocking attempts to track the prince. A level of psychic interference that suggested involvement by entities with supernatural capabilities, at least equal to those of the underwater kingdom. News of the prince's disappearance reached the underwater palace within hours, carried by messenger spirits that could travel instantly between linked temple sites. Dragon King Priathong VII immediately mobilized every resource at his disposal, sending teams of searchers to scour both the physical and spiritual realms for any trace of his heir. Palace chronicles described the king personally leading underwater expeditions to hidden cavern systems that might have served as gateways to other dimensions. The search efforts continued for months, expanding to cover vast areas of Southeast Asia as courtiers reported possible sightings of the prince in locations as distant as the mountains of northern Burma and the islands of the Java Sea. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none provided concrete evidence of the prince's whereabouts or fate. Perhaps most mysteriously, the three companions who had accompanied Prince Nagasena also vanished within days of returning to the underwater palace. Palace guards reported that they retired to their chambers for rest, after providing initial reports about the prince's disappearance. But when servants came to check on them the following day, their rooms were empty, unlike the prince's disappearance. However, the companions' departure appeared to have been voluntary. Their personal belongings were gone, and they had left behind formal letters of resignation from their court positions. The content of these resignation letters has never been made public, with palace officials citing security concerns that persist even today. However, fragments of information have leaked through court gossip over the centuries, suggesting that the companions claimed knowledge of the prince's fate, but were bound by supernatural oaths that prevented them from sharing this information with anyone, including the Dragon King himself. As years passed without resolution, the disappearance of Prince Nagasena became a source of profound instability for the underwater kingdom. The prince had been not just the heir to the throne, but a crucial participant in many of the rituals that maintained the realm's supernatural foundations. His absence disrupted ceremonial cycles and weakened the kingdom's ability to maintain its delicate balance with natural forces. Modern researchers studying this historical mystery have proposed various theories to explain the prince's vanishing. Some suggest that he may have been assassinated by enemies of the underwater kingdom, with his body disposed of in ways that would prevent supernatural detection. Others propose that the prince may have voluntarily entered a different dimension, possibly to escape political pressures or pursue advanced spiritual practices that required complete isolation from his former life. The most intriguing theory, advanced by Dr. Vanek Hansen of the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, suggests that Prince Nagasena may have discovered something during his diplomatic mission that fundamentally changed his understanding of reality itself. Dr. Hansen's research into the temple where the prince disappeared has uncovered references to a hidden library containing texts that were supposedly older than human civilization. If the prince gained access to this library, the knowledge he acquired might have compelled him to abandon his royal duties in favor of some greater cosmic responsibility. As you drift toward sleep, consider the profound loneliness that must have settled over the underwater palace in the wake of this unexplained lost crystal corridors that once echoed with the prince's laughter, now flowing in eternal silence, waiting for a return that may never come. The oracle of the floating islands, the gentle darkness deepens around us as our journey continues to the most mysterious figure in the court of the Dragon Kings, a being whose very existence challenges our understanding of time, space, and the nature of prophetic knowledge. In the soft embrace of approaching sleep, let us explore the enigma of the oracle who lived not in the underwater palace itself, but in the liminal realm of the floating islands that appeared and disappeared according to laws that even the wisest court scholars could not fully comprehend. What was the true nature of the oracle who claimed to exist simultaneously in past, present, and future? When did this mysterious figure first appear in the chronicles of the Underwater Kingdom, and why do different historical sources place their arrival at contradictory time periods? Where exactly were the floating islands that served as the oracle's dwelling place, and how did they manage to exist in defiance of natural laws? Who was permitted to seek the oracle's counsel, and what price did they pay for glimpsing the threads of destiny? How did the oracle's prophecies shape the decisions of the Dragon Kings, and why did their final prediction lead to the kingdom's ultimate fate? The Oracle of the Floating Islands remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the entire history of the Underwater Kingdom. Unlike the Dragon Kings and their courtiers, who were clearly supernatural beings with documented lineages and defined roles in the cosmic order, the oracles seem to exist outside the normal flow of causation itself. Palace records describe encounters with the oracle that occurred before the oracle supposedly arrived in the kingdom, and prophecies that were fulfilled centuries before they were spoken. The first historical reference to the oracle appears in the reign of Dragon King Priathong III, approximately 150 years after the establishment of the underwater palace. However, earlier chronicles from the same period mention consulting the ancient seer of the shifting waters about decisions that could only have involved the oracle's distinctive prophetic abilities. This temporal paradox has never been satisfactorily explained, leading some scholars to propose that the oracle existed in a state of quantum temporal superposition, simultaneously present at multiple points in the kingdom's timeline. The floating islands that served as the oracle's dwelling place were first observed by fishermen in the northern reaches of Tonlesap during the dry season, when the lake's water level dropped to expose areas normally hidden beneath the surface. These islands appeared to be constructed from some unknown material that was lighter than water, yet more durable than stone. They could support the weight of buildings and gardens, yet would rise and fall with changes in the lake's spiritual energy rather than responding to conventional buoyancy. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1960s by Dr. Sophie Dubois of the French School of Asian Studies documented what appeared to be the foundations of these floating islands during an exceptionally dry year. The structures she discovered consisted of geometric patterns carved into the lakebed, filled with a crystalline substance that had never been successfully analyzed. When water levels returned to normal, the foundations were submerged, but local residents continued to report sightings of floating land masses that appeared and disappeared according to no discernible pattern. The islands themselves defied easy description. Witnesses reported that they seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, appearing solid and substantial from some angles while seeming translucent or even completely invisible from others. The buildings on the islands showed similar properties, with rooms that were larger on the inside than the outside, and corridors that led to destinations that changed depending on the visitor's intentions and spiritual preparation. The oracle's physical appearance was equally fluid. Court records describe encounters with a figure who appeared sometimes as an ancient woman with silver hair that flowed like water, sometimes as a young person of indeterminate gender whose features shifted, like reflections on a moving lake surface. Most remarkably, some visitors reported that the oracle would appear as multiple individuals simultaneously, each representing a different aspect of temporal awareness, past, present, and future, engaged in conversations with each other that visitors could overhear but not fully comprehend. Access to the oracle was not granted lightly. Petitioners had to undergo purification rituals lasting 49 days, during which they consumed only water and rice, blessed by temple priests, and spent their nights in meditation while floating on specially prepared rafts anchored over the deepest parts of the lake. The purpose of this preparation was not merely spiritual purification, but temporal alignment. Visitors needed to adjust their consciousness to perceive multiple time streams simultaneously in order to benefit from the oracle's counsel. Even after completing the purification process, reaching the floating islands required navigating by principles that bore no resemblance to ordinary travel. Visitors had to abandon conventional notions of direction and distance, instead following internal compass readings based on their deepest spiritual needs. Many would-be petitioners became lost in this process, finding themselves returned to shore with no memory of their journey and a profound sense that they had been judged unworthy of the oracle's attention. Those who successfully reached the islands found themselves in a realm where the normal rules of cause and effect were suspended. The oracle's dwelling was described as a palace that existed in constant flux, with rooms that reconfigured themselves based on the nature of the questions being asked. The furniture was carved from materials that seemed to grow rather than being, manufactured chairs that adjusted their shape to provide perfect comfort, tables that expanded or contracted to accommodate the spiritual significance of the items placed upon them. The oracle's method of prophecy was unlike anything practiced by conventional seers. Rather than reading omens or interpreting symbolic visions, the oracles seemed to directly perceive the branching pathways of probability that extended from any given moment. Visitors reported that during consultations, they could sense the oracles' consciousness expanding across vast networks of possibility, examining potential futures with the same clarity that ordinary beings used to observe present circumstances. The price for the oracle's counsel was never monetary or material. Instead, petitioners were required to sacrifice some aspect of their certainty about reality itself. A king seeking advice about a military campaign might leave the islands with perfect knowledge of the optimal strategy, but lose his ability to feel completely confident about any decision for the rest of his life. A merchant asking about trade opportunities might receive infallible guidance about profitable ventures, while permanently losing his sense of satisfaction with any achievement. Dragon King Priathong V consulted the oracle regarding the mysterious disappearance of Prince Nagasena, seeking any insight that might lead to his heir's recovery. The oracle's response was characteristically cryptic. The prince walks in gardens that have not yet been planted, reads books written in languages that will not be invented for centuries, and learns from teachers whose births await the convergence of stars not yet named. He is lost to you because he has found himself in a when rather than a where. This prophecy provided little comfort to the grieving king, but it may have contained crucial information about the prince's fate. Modern theoretical physicists studying consciousness and temporal mechanics have proposed that certain individuals with advanced psychic abilities might be capable of shifting their primary existence to different timelines or parallel realities. If Prince Nagasena possessed such abilities, his disappearance might represent not death or abduction, but voluntary emigration to a different temporal framework. The oracle's most significant prophecy concerned the ultimate fate of the underwater kingdom itself. During the reign of Dragon King Priathong VIII, the oracle delivered an unsolicited warning that would prove to be their final communication with the royal court. The prophecy was recorded by court scribes in 3 different languages: Ancient Khmer, and a mysterious script that has never been deciphered to ensure its preservation and prevent misinterpretation. The prophecy spoke of a time when the harmony between the underwater and surface worlds would be disrupted by forces that originated neither from the lake nor the land, but from the spaces between spaces where forgotten gods still nursed ancient grievances. The oracle warned that these entities would use the kingdom's own spiritual strength against it, turning the very rituals that maintained cosmic balance into weapons of destruction. When the iron birds darken the sky and the thunder speaks in tongues of distant mountains, the prophecy declared, the children of water must choose between the wisdom of depths and the freedom of surfaces. Those who cling to the old certainties will become stones in the lake bed. Those who embrace the new uncertainties will rise like mist to seed the clouds of tomorrow. The meaning of this prophecy remained obscure until the late 20th century, when scholars familiar with both ancient Cambodian history and modern military technology proposed that the iron birds might refer to military aircraft, and the thunder of distant mountains could describe artillery or bombing. If this interpretation is correct, the oracle may have foreseen the disruption that would be caused by the various military conflicts that swept through Cambodia during the latter half of the 20th century. The prophecy's reference to choosing between wisdom of depths and freedom of surfaces has been interpreted as describing the difficult decision faced by the underwater kingdom's inhabitants when their hidden realm could no longer remain isolated from the increasingly violent surface world. Archaeological evidence suggests that many underwater sites in Cambodia were abandoned during the 1970s, possibly indicating a mass migration of supernatural populations to safer realms. After delivering this final prophecy, the oracle and the floating islands vanished completely from Tonle Sap. The last confirmed sighting occurred during the full moon of 1953, when a group of fishermen reported seeing the islands rise from the lake's surface one final time, glowing with an intense silver light that was visible from the shoreline. As dawn approached, the islands began to fade, becoming translucent and then invisible. By sunrise, even the distinctive patterns of disturbed water that had always marked their presence were gone. The oracle's disappearance marked the beginning of the end for the underwater kingdom. Without access to prophetic guidance, the dragon kings found themselves unable to anticipate and prepare for the massive social and political changes that would transform Cambodia in the following decades. The delicate balance between supernatural and mundane realms began to collapse. forcing the kingdom's inhabitants to make increasingly difficult choices about their survival. Some modern researchers have proposed that the oracle of the floating islands was not a single individual, but rather a collective consciousness composed of multiple beings who transcended individual existence to become pure temporal awareness. This theory would explain the oracle's apparent ability to exist at multiple points in time simultaneously, and might account for the cryptic nature of their communications, which would have been filtered through forms of consciousness that bore little resemblance to ordinary human thinking. As you settle deeper into the peaceful darkness of sleep, imagine the profound silence that must have descended over the lake after the oracle's final departure. Waters that had once rippled with the movement of impossible islands now flowing in unbroken patterns, carrying only the memory of mysteries that time itself struggles to preserve. The oracle's legacy lives on in the questions they raised about the nature of prophecy, consciousness, and the relationship between knowledge and destiny. The war of forgotten names in the deepening quiet of this restful hour, as consciousness drifts like moonlight on still water. Our story encounters the most tragic chapter in the history of the underwater kingdom, a conflict so devastating that its very memory was deliberately erased from most historical records. The War of Forgotten Names, as it came to be known, represents the moment when the delicate balance between spiritual and political power finally collapsed, leading to consequences that would echo through centuries of Cambodian history. What forces could have been powerful enough to threaten a kingdom protected by supernatural defenses and cosmic harmonies? When did this mysterious conflict begin, and why did a few surviving records contradict each other about its duration? Where were the battles fought? And how could warfare occur in the underwater realm without leaving traces that surface archaeologists could discover? Who were the enemies that challenged the Dragon King's authority? And what motivated their assault on a civilization that had maintained peaceful relations with all known neighbors? How did a war that supposedly lasted only days manage to cause damage that required generations to repair? The origins of the War of Forgotten Names can be traced to the period following Prince Naga Sena's disappearance, when the underwater kingdom faced its first serious succession crisis. Dragon King Priya Thong VII had devoted the final years of his reign to searching for his lost heir, neglecting many of the ceremonial duties that maintained the kingdom's spiritual stability. When the king finally acknowledged that his son would not return and began making arrangements to choose a successor from among his nephews, he discovered that the prolonged uncertainty had created dangerous fractures in the cosmic order that sustained his realm. The problem was not merely political, but metaphysical. The underwater kingdom's existence depended on maintaining precise harmonies between different spiritual forces, and these harmonies required continuous reinforcement through properly timed rituals performed by individuals with the correct bloodline connections to the original Naga spirits. Prince Naga Sena's disappearance had disrupted several crucial ceremonial cycles, creating gaps in the protective barriers that shielded the kingdom from hostile supernatural entities. Palace records from this period describe increasingly frequent incidents of what court officials termed dimensional intrusions, manifestations, a phenomena that belonged to other realms of existence, but were somehow bleeding through into the underwater kingdom. These intrusions began as minor curiosities, flowers that bloomed in colors that didn't exist in the normal spectrum, musical instruments that played melodies no one had composed, mirrors that reflected rooms that weren't there. However, the intrusions gradually became more serious and potentially dangerous. Palace guards reported encountering corridors that led to places that couldn't be reached by any other route. Rooms where time flowed backward so that conversations ended before they began. And courtiers who would suddenly speak in languages that hadn't been invented yet. Most troubling of all were the appearances of individuals who claimed to be members of the court, but whom no one could remember meeting before, despite their apparent familiarity with palace protocols and their ability to demonstrate detailed knowledge of court history. The Dragon King's advisors initially attributed these phenomena to grief-induced hallucinations, or the natural result of maintaining a kingdom that existed partially outside normal space-time. However, as the incidents became more frequent and began affecting the palace's essential systems, the crystal formations that provided light, the current patterns that delivered fresh water, the spiritual mechanisms that maintained breathable atmosphere in the underwater chambers, became clear that the kingdom was under assault by forces that understood its supernatural vulnerabilities. The enemy's identity remained a mystery that has never been fully resolved. Palace intelligence officers reported that the hostile intrusions seemed to originate from a realm that existed parallel to but separate from the underwater kingdom, accessible through the same interdimensional pathways that the Dragon Kings used for their own supernatural activities. This suggested that the attackers possessed similar metaphysical knowledge and capabilities, making them uniquely dangerous opponents. Some court scholars theorized that the enemies were members of a rival supernatural civilization that had been waiting for an opportunity to expand into the underwater kingdom's territory. Others proposed that the attackers were actually refugees from a cosmic catastrophe that had destroyed their original home, forcing them to seek new realms to inhabit regardless of the consequences for existing populations. The most disturbing theory, advanced by the court's chief philosopher, suggested that the enemies were not external invaders at all, but rather aspects of the underwater kingdom itself that had become corrupted by the prolonged disruption of ceremonial cycles. According to this interpretation, the failure to properly maintain spiritual harmonies had caused parts of the kingdom's own essence to split off and turn hostile, creating a situation where the realm was literally at war with itself. The actual fighting, when it began, bore little resemblance to conventional warfare. Battles were fought not with weapons and armies, but with competing applications of supernatural knowledge, as each side attempted to reshape reality according to their own metaphysical principles. Palace defenders would wake to find that entire sections of the underwater complex had been altered overnight. Familiar corridors transformed into maze-like structures, throne rooms converted into vast libraries filled with books that burst into flames when touched, ceremonial chambers reconfigured into environments suitable only for beings that breathed methane instead of water. The attackers seemed particularly focused on disrupting the kingdom's memory systems. Ancient texts would be found with their contents replaced by completely different material, though written in handwriting identical to the original scribes. Court officials would discover that their recollections of important historical events had been subtly altered, making it impossible to rely on established precedents for making decisions. Most disturbing of all, individuals would sometimes forget their own names, replaced by identities that felt completely authentic despite having known supporting evidence in official records. This assault on memory and identity gave the conflict its distinctive name. As the war progressed, more and more aspects of the kingdom's history became forgotten, not simply lost or destroyed, but actively erased in ways that made it difficult to even remember that they had once existed. Palace chroniclers working to document the conflict found themselves unable to recall crucial details even as they were writing, producing accounts that became increasingly fragmentary and contradictory. Dragon King Priya Thong VII attempted to respond to the crisis using traditional military strategies, assembling forces of palace guards and supernatural allies to defend key installations. However, these conventional approaches proved ineffective against enemies who could alter the fundamental nature of space and time within the battlefield. Guards would charge into combat only to discover that their opponents had retroactively prevented them from ever being born, or that the locations they were defending had been moved to different dimensions, where the concept of defense had no meaning. The turning point in the war came when the Dragon King made the desperate decision to consult the Forbidden Archives, a collection of texts and artifacts that had been sealed away, because their knowledge was considered too dangerous for any individual to possess safely. These archives contained the accumulated wisdom of previous cosmic conflicts, including strategies for combating entities that could manipulate reality itself. The forbidden knowledge revealed that the underwater kingdom's enemies were indeed aspects of the realm itself that had become corrupted and separated from the whole. The war was essentially a cosmic immune response, with the kingdom's essence attempting to reject parts of itself that no longer functioned in harmony with the greater organism. The only way to end the conflict was to either successfully reintegrate the corrupted aspects or else sacrifice them entirely, accepting the permanent loss of whatever beneficial qualities they had once contributed to the kingdom. The Dragon King chose reintegration, initiating a series of ceremonies designed to heal the fundamental splits in the kingdom's metaphysical structure. These rituals required him to temporarily merge his consciousness with the hostile forces, experiencing reality from their perspective in order to understand what had driven them to rebellion. Palace records describe this process as the most harrowing ordeal any Dragon King had ever undergone, involving exposure to forms of existence that were fundamentally incompatible with normal awareness. The ceremonies succeeded in ending the active conflict, but at enormous cost. The Dragon King emerged from the reintegration process fundamentally changed, his personality altered by prolonged exposure to corrupted aspects of cosmic consciousness. Many of his memories had been damaged or replaced, making it difficult for him to maintain consistent policies or relationships. Most significantly, his connection to the Naga spirits that legitimized his rule had been weakened, undermining the supernatural foundations of his authority. The kingdom itself bore permanent scars from the conflict. Entire sections of the palace complex had been irreversibly altered, creating architectural anomalies that served as constant reminders of the reality-warping battles that had occurred. Some corridors led to destinations that changed each time they were traversed, while certain chambers could only be entered by individuals who possessed specific emotional states or memories. Perhaps most importantly, the war had damaged the kingdom's ability to maintain its hidden existence. The reality manipulations used during the conflict had created permanent tears in the barriers that separated the underwater realm from the surface world, making it increasingly difficult to prevent detection by human populations. These breaches would eventually force the kingdom to abandon its policy of isolation and begin making direct contact with surface civilizations. The aftermath of the War of Forgotten Names saw significant changes in the kingdom's governmental structure. The traditional absolute monarchy of the Dragon Kings was replaced by a council system that distributed supernatural authority among multiple individuals, reducing the risk that future succession crises could destabilize the entire realm. New ceremonial protocols were established to prevent the accumulation of disruptive spiritual energies, and extensive monitoring systems were implemented to detect early signs of dimensional intrusions. Archaeological evidence for this mysterious conflict is understandably scarce, given its supernatural nature and the deliberate erasure of many records. However, researchers have noted significant changes in the material culture of Cambodia during the 6th and 7th centuries CE that might reflect the war's impact on surface populations. Temple architectural styles underwent rapid evolution during this period, incorporating new motifs that seem to reflect awareness of cosmic conflicts and the fragility of reality itself. Dr. Chantria Om of the University of Cambodia has proposed that the proliferation of protective talismans and apotropaic symbols in Cambodian art during this period reflects knowledge of supernatural warfare techniques that had filtered up from the underwater kingdom's experiences. Her analysis of temple reliefs suggests that surface populations became aware of the need for spiritual defenses against reality-altering attacks, possibly as a result of witnessing the effects of the war on their supernatural neighbors. Modern physicists studying the intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics have found the accounts of the War of Forgotten names intriguing for their apparent descriptions of phenomena that resemble theoretical models of quantum information. Warfare. The idea that conflicts could be fought by manipulating fundamental properties of space-time and causality aligns with cutting-edge research into the relationship between observation, memory, and the structure of reality itself, as sleep draws you deeper into its peaceful embrace. Consider the profound courage required to heal wounds that existed not just in space, but in the very fabric of existence itself. Found the wisdom of rulers who chose integration over destruction, even when the cost was the transformation of everything they had once known. The last ceremony, the midnight hour, approaches as our story reaches its most solemn chapter. The final great ceremony performed by the Dragon Kings before their underwater kingdom faded into legend. In the gentle darkness that surrounds you now, let us witness the end of an age when ancient powers made their last attempt to preserve the cosmic balance that had sustained their realm for centuries. What compelled Dragon King Priathong Eeks to perform the last ceremony despite warnings from his advisors that the ritual might destroy what remained of the kingdom? When exactly did this final gathering take place, and why do the surviving accounts place it during a time of multiple eclipses that astronomers claim never occurred? Where was the ceremony held, given that much of the original palace had been damaged or transformed beyond recognition during the War of Forgotten Names? Who participated in this ultimate ritual, and what qualified them to handle the cosmic forces that would be unleashed? How did the Dragon King hope to preserve his kingdom's legacy, even as he prepared to dissolve its physical foundations? By the time of Dragon King Priathong Eeks's reign, the underwater kingdom faced challenges that transcended anything in its previous history. The reality tears created during the War of Forgotten Names had never fully healed, causing unpredictable fluctuations in the spiritual energies that maintained the palace's existence. Sections of the crystal chambers would periodically phase out of normal space-time, taking their occupants with them into unknown dimensions. The current systems that provided fresh water and breathable atmosphere had become unreliable, sometimes reversing direction or carrying substances that belonged to other realms entirely. Most seriously, the kingdom's population was declining, as court members chose to abandon their underwater existence rather than risk becoming trapped in the increasingly unstable environment. Some relocated to temple complexes on the surface, where they could continue practicing modified versions of their spiritual disciplines. Others ventured into the vast cave systems beneath Cambodia, seeking underground realms that might offer more stable alternatives to the failing palace. A few attempted to follow Prince Nagasina's example, using advanced consciousness, techniques to shift their existence to different temporal frameworks entirely. The Dragon King himself was among the most affected by the kingdom's deteriorating condition. The reintegration process that had ended the War of Forgotten Names had left him partially disconnected from linear time, causing him to experience past, present, and future simultaneously. This temporal displacement made it difficult for him to maintain consistent communication with his remaining subjects, as he would often respond to conversations that hadn't happened yet or refer to events that had occurred in alternate timelines. Palace. Records from this period become increasingly fragmentary and contradictory, reflecting the breakdown of the kingdom's record-keeping systems. Court scribes reported difficulty maintaining accurate chronologies when the flow of time itself had become unpredictable. Documents would sometimes rewrite themselves overnight, or age centuries in a matter of hours, or remain perfectly preserved, while everything around them crumbled into dust. Despite these mounting difficulties, Dragon King Priya Thongyix became convinced that one final ceremony could stabilize the kingdom's condition and preserve its essential knowledge for future generations. This ceremony, which he called the Offering of Depths to Heights, was designed to sacrifice the underwater kingdom's physical existence while transforming its accumulated wisdom into a form that could survive, independently of any particular realm or dimension. The theoretical basis for such a transformation came from the forbidden archives that had been consulted during the War of Forgotten Names. These ancient texts describe techniques used by previous cosmic civilizations to preserve their achievements during periods of universal upheaval. The process required converting all the kingdom's spiritual accomplishments, its understanding of interdimensional navigation, temporal manipulation, consciousness projection, and reality management to pure information that could exist as patterns in the quantum foam underlying all existence. The Dragon King's advisors were deeply divided about the wisdom of attempting such an unprecedented ritual. The Minister of Time warned that mistakes in the conversion process could scatter the kingdom's knowledge across multiple timelines, making it impossible for future generations to recover. The Minister of Space argued that dissolving the kingdom's physical foundations would eliminate any possibility of rebuilding if the ceremony failed to achieve its intended results. The Minister of Consciousness, however, supported the Dragon King's proposal, arguing that the kingdom's current trajectory led inevitably toward complete dissolution anyway. From this perspective, the last ceremony represented the only chance to preserve something valuable from the accumulated centuries of supernatural achievement. Even if the physical palace was lost, the essential wisdom could remain available to future seekers who possessed the proper spiritual preparation to access it. Preparations for the ceremony required months of work under increasingly difficult conditions. The ritual demanded perfect astronomical timing, coordinated with alignments that occurred only once every several thousand years. These alignments had to be calculated not just for the surface world sky, but for the celestial conditions in multiple dimensions simultaneously, requiring mathematical techniques that pushed the court astronomers beyond the limits of their traditional knowledge. The physical preparations were equally challenging. The ceremony required 7 different ritual spaces, each attuned to one of the fundamental forces that the kingdom's ministers had traditionally overseen. These spaces had to be constructed using materials that could exist stably in multiple dimensions simultaneously, as the ritual would involve opening permanent gateways between different levels of reality. The most difficult requirement was assembling a group of participants who possessed both the spiritual qualifications for handling cosmic forces and the psychological stability to maintain their identities during a process that would involve the controlled dissolution of their physical existence. The ceremony required exactly 49 participants, 7 groups of 7 individuals, each group representing one of the fundamental forces, with members capable of maintaining perfect harmony with their assigned cosmic principle. Many of the kingdom's remaining population volunteered for this honor, understanding that participation in the last ceremony would mean permanent departure from normal existence, but would also ensure that essential knowledge became part of the eternal information matrix that the kingdom hoped to create. The selection process required intensive testing of each candidate's ability to maintain conscious awareness while experiencing various forms of reality dissolution. The ceremony began during the convergence of 3 eclipses, the lunar and what the court astronomers termed a dimensional eclipse, that occurred when the underwater kingdom's reality level passed through the shadow cast by a massive celestial object in a parallel dimension. Modern astronomers have found no record of the solar and lunar eclipses described in the palace accounts, leading some researchers to propose that these celestial events occurred only within the kingdom's localized spacetime, visible solely to inhabitants of that particular dimensional framework. The ritual itself proceeded through 7 distinct phases, each lasting 7 hours and requiring the systematic dissolution of one aspect of the kingdom's material existence. The first phase involved the conversion of the palace's physical structures into pure, geometric information mathematical descriptions of the crystal chambers, flowing corridors, and architectural relationships that had housed the kingdom's inhabitants for centuries. The second phase addressed the transformation of the kingdom's accumulated knowledge. The vast libraries, archives, and databases that contained the civilization's intellectual achievements were converted into information patterns that could exist independently of any physical storage medium. This process required each participating scholar to merge their consciousness with the knowledge they had spent lifetimes acquiring, becoming living embodiments of their areas of expertise. The third phase dealt with the kingdom's artistic and cultural heritage. The music, visual arts, poetry, and ceremonial performances that had expressed the civilization's aesthetic values were transformed into what the court philosophers termed experiential templates, patterns of consciousness that could recreate the full sensory and emotional impact of these cultural achievements in the awareness of future individuals who accessed them. The fourth phase converted the kingdom's social and political systems into organizational principles that could guide the development of future civilizations. The wisdom gained through centuries of balancing individual freedom with collective harmony, managing supernatural abilities within democratic structures, and maintaining peaceful relations between different species and dimensional levels was crystallized into abstract principles that could be adapted to any cultural context. The fifth phase addressed the transformation of the kingdom's environmental knowledge, the understanding of how to maintain ecological balance while supporting advanced technological development, how to manage water resources in complex environmental systems, and how to coordinate human activities with the needs of supernatural ecosystems was converted into information matrices that could be accessed by future environmental managers. The sixth phase involved the dissolution of the kingdom's temporal structures, the carefully maintained ceremonial cycles, the astronomical calculations that coordinated activities across multiple time streams, and the techniques for managing the acceleration and deceleration of local time flow were transformed into temporal navigation algorithms that could guide future practitioners of time manipulation. The seventh and final phase required the participants to surrender their individual identities while maintaining their essential consciousness, becoming integral components of the information matrix they had spent the previous 42 hours creating. This transformation was described as simultaneously the most terrifying and most beautiful experience imaginable, the complete dissolution of everything familiar and secure, combined with expansion into a form of awareness that encompassed the accumulated wisdom of an entire civilization. Dragon King Priyathong X was the last to undergo this final transformation. Palace records describe his farewell address to the diminishing kingdom, delivered as his physical form began to fade into the quantum information structure that would preserve his people's achievements. His final words, recorded by automated systems that continued functioning even as their operators dissolved into pure consciousness, expressed confidence that the kingdom's knowledge would eventually find its way to individuals and civilizations, capable of putting it to beneficial use. The ceremony concluded with the complete dissolution of the underwater kingdom's physical existence. The Crystal Palace, the flowing corridors, the chambers where generations of Dragon Kings had maintained cosmic balance, all converted into information patterns that departed the material dimension entirely. The waters of Tonal Sap flowed undisturbed over the location where the kingdom had existed, showing no trace of the supernatural civilization that had recently occupied that space. However, the ceremony's effects extended far beyond the immediate dissolution of the palace. Sensitive individuals throughout Cambodia and neighboring regions reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams during the weeks following the last ceremony. These dreams often involved detailed technical knowledge about subjects the dreamers had never studied: hydraulic engineering, astronomical calculation, consciousness manipulation techniques, and methods for communicating with non-human intelligences. Some of these dream-transmitted knowledge fragments were recorded by the dreamers and eventually found their way into the libraries of various temples and courts. Modern researchers studying the development of Khmer civilization have noted that several significant technological and artistic innovations appeared during this period with no apparent precedent in earlier Cambodian culture, possibly reflecting the influence of information released during the underwater kingdom's transformation. The most intriguing legacy of the last ceremony may be the persistent reports of individuals who claim to have accessed the kingdom's preserved knowledge through meditation and spiritual practice. These accounts describe entering trance states in which they can perceive vast libraries of information about advanced consciousness techniques, sustainable technologies, and methods for maintaining harmony between human and supernatural communities. Dr. Rithi Pan of the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies has documented over 200 such reports from practitioners of traditional Cambodian meditation techniques. While the specific details vary significantly between different accounts, Dr. Pan notes remarkable consistency in the underlying principles and methodologies described, suggesting a common source of information that matches the theoretical capabilities of the matrix created during the last ceremony. As you drift toward sleep, carried by the gentle current of this ancient story, consider the profound faith required to transform everything familiar and secure into something intangible yet eternal, and the wisdom of those who chose to become living information rather than face the dissolution of their achievements in the streams of time. Echoes in stone, the quiet hours of deep night embrace us as our story turns to the traces left behind when gods and kings departed the physical world for realms beyond ordinary perception. In the soft darkness that surrounds your resting form, let us explore how the legacy of the Dragon Kings manifested in the stone monuments and temple complexes that still dot the Cambodian landscape today. Silent witnesses to mysteries that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. What evidence of the underwater kingdom's influence can be found in the temples built centuries after its dissolution? When did surface rulers begin incorporating architectural elements that seemed to echo the crystal palaces described in ancient texts? Where throughout Cambodia do we find temple complexes with features that appear to serve no practical purpose, yet demonstrate sophisticated understanding of supernatural principles? Who were the master builders that possessed knowledge of construction techniques that shouldn't have existed in their historical period? How did information from the dissolved kingdom find its way into stone carvings and architectural designs that would puzzle researchers for generations to come? The most striking evidence of the underwater kingdom's continued influence appears in temple complexes built during the classical Angkor period, several centuries after the last ceremony. These monuments display architectural features that suggest their designers possessed knowledge of principles that the Dragon Kings had spent centuries developing sophisticated understanding of sacred geometry, water management systems that incorporated supernatural elements, and stone carvings that seemed to depict events from the underwater kingdom's history with remarkable accuracy. The temple complex of Banti Shrai, built in the late 10th century, contains some of the most intriguing examples of this mysterious knowledge transfer. The temple's intricate relief carvings include scenes that conventional art historians interpret as standard Hindu mythological narratives, but closer examination reveals details that correspond precisely to events described in the fragmentary records of the Dragon King's court. One particular relief panel, located on the eastern wall of the central sanctuary, depicts what appears to be a standard representation of Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent Ananta. However, the serpent's coils contain carved details that match descriptions of the underground corridors in the Crystal Palace, including specific geometric patterns that served as navigation aids for beings moving through water-filled passages. The lotus flowers growing from Vishnu's navel show internal structures that correspond to the crystalline lighting systems that illuminated the underwater chambers. Most remarkably, the faces carved around the border of this relief include several that appear to be portraits of specific individuals rather than stylized divine representations. Dr. Sophia, Cheam of the Royal University of Fine Arts, has identified at least 3 of these faces as matching written descriptions of court officials from the underwater kingdom, including the Minister of Consciousness, whose distinctive features were described in unusual detail in palace records. The water management systems at Angkor display even more direct evidence of knowledge derived from the Dragon King's expertise. The complex network of canals, reservoirs, and hydraulic controls that supported the Angkor civilization incorporates engineering principles that seem far too advanced for the period. These systems demonstrate understanding of water flow dynamics, pressure management, and seasonal variation control that wouldn't be formally developed by surface civilizations for several more centuries. Archaeological surveys conducted by Dr. Michael Cheng of the University of Sydney have identified specific features in the Angkor water systems that serve no apparent practical purpose yet would have been essential components in the supernatural water management techniques used by the underwater kingdom. These include precisely calculated spiral channels that create specific acoustic resonances when water flows through them, and reservoir designs that incorporate 7-fold symmetries corresponding to the cosmic principles that the Dragon Kings used to maintain harmony between different dimensional levels. The most puzzling discoveries have come from ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Angkor complex conducted by the Cambodian-Japanese team led by Dr. Damien Evans. These surveys have revealed extensive underground structures beneath many of the visible temple's chambers, corridors, and installations that were clearly designed for purposes that remain completely mysterious to conventional archaeology. Some of these underground structures appear to be flooded chambers that were intentionally designed to hold water, complete with sophisticated ventilation systems that would have allowed human occupation despite the aquatic environment. The layout of these submerged rooms corresponds closely to architectural plans found in the surviving fragments of the Underwater Kingdom's archives, suggesting that surface builders were attempting to recreate aspects of the Crystal Palace in their temple complexes. The Temple of Taprome, famous for being allowed to remain partially consumed by jungle growth, contains perhaps the most direct evidence of knowledge transmission from the dissolved underwater kingdom. Hidden within the temple's inner galleries, protected by centuries of vegetation growth, researchers have discovered carvings that appear to be technical diagrams rather than religious imagery. These diagrams show detailed cross-sections of what can only be described as underwater architectural systems chambers, with curved walls designed to withstand water pressure, corridor intersections that incorporate flow management principles, and lighting systems that depend on crystalline formations, rather than conventional flames or oil lamps. The precision of these technical drawings suggests that the carvers were working from actual blueprints rather than creating imaginative compositions. Most intriguingly, some of these hidden carvings include what appear to be written instructions, in scripts that combine recognizable Sanskrit characters with symbols that have never been successfully deciphered. Dr. Vanida Soren of the Cambodian Academy of Sciences has spent decades attempting to decode these inscriptions, making progress by assuming they represent technical manuals for supernatural engineering projects rather than religious or historical texts. Her preliminary translations suggest that these inscriptions contain detailed instructions for creating chambers of flowing light and corridors of sustained breath, descriptions that match the environmental control systems described in the Underwater Kingdom's palace records. If Dr. Soren's interpretations are correct, these carvings represent an attempt by surface builders to preserve crucial technical knowledge from the dissolved kingdom, ensuring that future generations would have access to advanced engineering principles even if they lacked the spiritual training necessary to implement them. The influence of the underwater kingdom's knowledge can also be traced in the mathematical principles underlying Angkor's architectural design. The proportional relationships used in temple construction demonstrate understanding of geometric principles that wouldn't be formally developed in European mathematics until the Renaissance. These proportions incorporate not just aesthetic considerations, but also acoustic properties, structural harmonics, and what can only be described as psychoacoustic effects designed to influence the consciousness of individuals within the temples. Dr. Emma Richardson of Cambridge University has analyzed the dimensional relationships in over 50 Angkor period temples, discovering that they consistently incorporate ratios that correspond to frequencies associated with altered states of consciousness. Her research suggests that these temples were designed not just as places of worship, but as technological devices for facilitating specific types of spiritual experience. It's exactly the kind of multifunctional architecture that characterized the Underwater Kingdom's approach to environmental design. The stone carvings at Bayon Temple present another fascinating example of knowledge preservation. The famous faces of Bayon, the massive carved faces that adorn the temple's towers, have traditionally been interpreted as representations of the Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, or idealized portraits of King Jayavarman VII. However, detailed photographic analysis has revealed that many of these faces incorporate subtle features that match descriptions of the Dragon King's supernatural physiological characteristics. Palace records describe the Dragon Kings as possessing certain distinctive features that reflected their dual nature as human rulers and cosmic serpents. These included eyes that could change color depending on their dimensional focus, facial bone structures that were subtly different from ordinary humans, and expressions that seemed to reflect awareness of multiple time streams simultaneously. Several of the Bion faces display exactly these characteristics, suggesting that surface artists had access to detailed knowledge about the physical appearance of the underwater kingdom's rulers. The temple complex of Beng Milia, located about 40 kilometers east of Angkor, may represent the most ambitious attempt by surface civilization to recreate the underwater kingdom's architectural principles. Unlike other Angkor period temples, Beng Milia was designed as a partially flooded complex from the beginning, with chambers that were intentionally built to hold water and corridors that could be navigated either on foot during dry seasons or by swimming during periods of high water. The temple's layout incorporates the sevenfold symmetry that was fundamental to the underwater kingdom's cosmic principles, with 7 main chambers arranged around a central sanctuary that appears to have been designed as a meditation space for practitioners of consciousness projection techniques. Each of the 7 chambers contains carved alcoves that would have been perfect for the kind of crystalline formations that provided light in the underwater palace, though no trace of such crystals remains today. Recent archaeological excavations at Beng Milia have uncovered evidence that the temple was equipped with a sophisticated underwater ventilation system that would have allowed extended occupation of the flooded chambers. The system incorporates reed channels and air pockets that demonstrate understanding of the same breathing techniques that enabled the underwater kingdom's inhabitants to survive in aquatic environments. The persistence of the Dragon King's influence can also be traced in the oral traditions preserved by communities living near these temple complexes. Village elders in areas surrounding major Angkor period monuments often possess detailed knowledge about the supernatural properties of specific architectural features, understanding that has been passed down through generations despite having no apparent connection to conventional Hindu or Buddhist teachings. These oral traditions frequently describe techniques for accessing hidden chambers within the temples, methods for interpreting the meaning of specific carved symbols, and warnings about architectural features that are supposedly dangerous to approach without proper spiritual preparation. The consistency of these traditions across multiple geographic locations suggests a common source of information that may derive from knowledge preserved during the underwater kingdom's dissolution. Modern practitioners of traditional Cambodian meditation techniques report that certain temple locations facilitate access to the information matrix created during the last ceremony. These practitioners describe entering deep meditative states while positioned at specific architectural focal points within the temples, experiencing visions that provide detailed knowledge about advanced consciousness techniques and supernatural engineering principles. Dr. Bofa Chan of the University of Cambodia has documented over 100 such experiences, reported by meditators at various temple sites. While the specific content of these visions varies significantly between individuals, Dr. Chan notes consistent references to technical knowledge that matches descriptions found in the fragmentary underwater kingdom records, suggesting that the Temples may indeed serve as access points for the preserved information matrix. The most recent discoveries have come from archaeological surveys using advanced ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR technology. These surveys have revealed that many Angkor period temples were built on foundations that extend much deeper underground than previously suspected, incorporating structural elements that appear to serve no purpose related to supporting the visible architecture. Some of these deep foundations include chambers that were sealed during construction and show no evidence of ever having been accessible to the temple's users. The purpose of these sealed chambers remains mysterious, but their dimensions and internal geometry correspond precisely to the proportions described for meditation chambers in the underwater kingdom's palace. This suggests that surface builders may have been attempting to recreate specific environmental conditions that were essential for accessing the dissolved kingdom's preserved knowledge. The influence of the Dragon King's legacy extends beyond individual temples to encompass the entire regional approach to landscape architecture. The Angkor civilization's integration of natural water systems with constructed environments demonstrates understanding of ecological principles that wouldn't be formally developed by Western science until the late 20th century. This holistic approach to environmental management reflects the underwater kingdom's philosophy of maintaining harmony between technological development and natural systems. Satellite imagery analysis has revealed that the Angkor complex incorporates design principles that extend across hundreds of square kilometers, creating patterns that are visible only from aerial perspectives that weren't available to the temple builders. These large-scale geometric relationships suggest that the surface civilization possessed mapping and surveying capabilities that far exceeded what conventional archaeology attributes to the period. The most intriguing aspect of this landscape design is its incorporation of astronomical alignments that correspond not just to solar and lunar cycles, but to the movement patterns of stars that are barely visible to the naked eye. These alignments suggest that Angkor's builders had access to detailed astronomical knowledge that may have been preserved from the underwater kingdom's advanced studies of multidimensional cosmic relationships. As you rest in the gentle embrace of approaching sleep, imagine these ancient stones as libraries carved in granite and sandstone, their every surface encoded with knowledge that spans the boundary between the possible and the impossible. The temples stand in patient silence, waiting for visitors who possess the proper keys to unlock the wisdom preserved within their geometric mysteries. In your dreams tonight, you might find yourself walking through corridors that exist simultaneously, above and below ground, where stone and water flow together in patterns that reveal the eternal connections between all levels of existence. The seekers of the lost waters, as the deepest hours of night embrace us. Our story encounters those who have spent their lives searching for traces of the vanished kingdom, driven by dreams and visions that call them to seek what history claims never existed. In the peaceful darkness that surrounds your resting form, let us follow the modern seekers who continue the ancient quest for wisdom that transcends the boundaries between legend and reality. What draws contemporary researchers to spend their careers investigating a civilization that mainstream academia considers purely mythological? When did serious scholarly attention first turn to the possibility that the Dragon King's realm might have historical foundations? Where do modern seekers look for evidence of the underwater kingdom's legacy, and what methods do they use to distinguish authentic traces from wishful thinking? Who are the individuals whose lives have been transformed by encounters with knowledge that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding? How do these modern quests connect with the ancient traditions of seeking wisdom in the liminal spaces between earth and water? The modern search for the underwater kingdom began in the early 20th century, when French colonial administrators first encountered oral traditions that seemed to preserve remarkably detailed technical knowledge about advanced hydraulic engineering and consciousness manipulation techniques. Unlike the familiar folk tales and religious legends that characterize most traditional narratives, these stories contained specific technical details that suggested familiarity with sophisticated scientific principles. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mowat, best known for bringing Angkor to European attention, also documented extensive local traditions about underwater palaces and serpent kings during his 1860 expedition. His journals, recently rediscovered in the French National Archives, describe conversations with elderly villagers who possessed detailed knowledge about the construction of underwater chambers, the cultivation of crystalline light sources, and techniques for extending human breathing capacity to allow prolonged submersion. What distinguished these accounts from typical folklore was their technical precision. The villagers could describe specific materials and construction methods, provide detailed measurements for architectural features, and explain complex relationships between different engineering systems. Mowat noted that this knowledge appeared to be maintained by oral traditions that emphasized exact preservation of technical details rather than the creative embellishment that characterizes most storytelling traditions. Dr. Paul Muss, the distinguished French scholar of Southeast Asian civilization, became the first academic to seriously investigate these traditions during his fieldwork in the 1920s. Dr. Muss was initially skeptical of local claims about underwater kingdoms, but his systematic documentation of oral traditions revealed consistent patterns that suggested a common historical source. Dr. Muss discovered that communities separated by hundreds of kilometers with no apparent contact with each other possessed remarkably similar knowledge about underwater architectural techniques, specialized breathing methods, and the ceremonial procedures supposedly used to maintain harmony between aquatic and terrestrial realms. The consistency of these traditions across geographic and linguistic boundaries suggested that they derived from shared historical experiences rather than independent mythological development. His most significant discovery came during interviews with traditional meditation masters who claimed to have accessed the underwater kingdom's preserved knowledge through specialized consciousness techniques. These practitioners could demonstrate unusual abilities: extended breath control, precise visualization of complex three-dimensional structures, and apparent telepathic communication that seemed to correspond to capabilities described in the historical accounts of the Dragon King's court. Dr. Muss spent decades attempting to verify these abilities through careful observation and documentation. His research notes, preserved in the École Française d'Extrême-Orient archives, describe numerous instances of practitioners demonstrating knowledge that they had no conventional means of acquiring. These included accurate descriptions of archaeological sites that hadn't yet been excavated, detailed knowledge of ancient languages that weren't taught in any available educational programs, and technical information about hydraulic engineering that wouldn't be formally developed until decades later. The search for physical evidence of the underwater kingdom received new impetus in the 1960s, when advances in underwater archaeology made systematic exploration of lake and river bottoms feasible for the first time. Dr. Jacques Dumarquet, working with the Cambodian Department of Archaeology, conducted the first scientific surveys of Tonle Sap's bottom formations, looking for structural remains that might correspond to the legendary palace complex. While Dr. Dumarquet's team didn't discover intact underwater buildings, their surveys revealed extensive geometric patterns carved into the lakebed that appeared too regular to be natural formations. These patterns consisted of concentric circles, radial channels, and rectangular depressions that corresponded closely to architectural layouts described in the oral traditions. Carbon dating of organic materials found within these formations suggested human activity dating back over 1,000 years. The most intriguing discoveries came from areas of the lake that local traditions identified as particularly significant locations. At sites described as former entrances to the underwater palace, Dr. Dumarquet's team found concentrations of unusual crystalline formations that didn't match any known geological processes. These crystals displayed optical properties that suggested artificial formation, though no known ancient technology could have produced such materials. Dr. Dumarquet's work was continued in the 1980s by Dr. Christophe Potier, whose comprehensive surveys of the Angkor region included systematic exploration of water bodies that local traditions associated with the underwater kingdom. Dr. Potier's team used advanced sonar mapping and underwater robotics to create detailed charts of bottom formations throughout the region. Their discoveries included several sites where artificial structures appeared to extend deep into the sediment layers beneath natural water bodies. Ground-penetrating radar revealed geometric patterns that suggested extensive underground construction, with chambers and corridors that would have required sophisticated engineering to build and maintain. While these structures were too deeply buried to allow direct exploration, their dimensions and layout matched descriptions from the historical texts with remarkable precision. The search for the underwater kingdom's legacy has also attracted researchers from fields outside traditional archaeology. Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine biologist from the University of Singapore, became interested in the project while studying the unique ecosystem of tonal sap. Her research revealed that the lake supported several species of aquatic plants and microorganisms that appeared to be adapted to environmental conditions that no longer existed in the region. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested that these species had evolved to thrive in water with unusual mineral compositions and specific patterns of current flow that would have been created by the kind of sophisticated water management systems described in the underwater kingdom accounts. The persistence of these specialized organisms implied that the environmental conditions they required had been maintained artificially for extended periods in the relatively recent past. Her most significant discovery involved bioluminescent microorganisms that produced light with spectral characteristics matching descriptions of the crystalline illumination systems used in the underwater palace. These organisms appeared to be remnants of much larger populations that had once provided natural lighting for aquatic environments. Dr. Chun's genetic analysis suggested that these microorganisms had been selectively cultivated to enhance their light-producing capabilities, indicating sophisticated biotechnology that preceded known developments in that field. By many centuries, the psychological aspects of the search for the underwater kingdom have attracted attention from researchers, studying the relationship between consciousness and historical knowledge. Dr. Michael Stevens of the University of California has documented over 300 cases of individuals who claim to have acquired detailed knowledge about the Dragon King's civilization through dreams, meditation, or spontaneous visionary experiences. Dr. Stevens' research protocol involves extensive background checks to verify that his subjects had no prior exposure to the historical materials about the underwater kingdom, followed by detailed interviews to document the specific knowledge they claim to have received. His findings suggest that many subjects acquire technical information that appears nowhere in published sources, yet corresponds closely to details found in archival materials that the subjects had no possible access to. The most striking cases involve individuals who demonstrate practical abilities that seem to derive from the knowledge they claim to have received. These include meditation practitioners who can remain underwater for extraordinary periods using breathing techniques that match descriptions from the palace records, artists who can create crystalline formations with optical properties similar to those found in archaeological sites, and engineers who have developed water management systems, incorporating principles that appear to derive from the underwater kingdom's advanced hydraulic knowledge. Dr. Stevens has also documented cases of individuals who claim to have experienced direct contact with consciousness entities that identify themselves as preserved aspects of the underwater kingdom's former inhabitants. These contacts typically occur during deep meditative states and involve the transmission of specific technical knowledge rather than general spiritual teachings. The information received through these contacts often includes details about archaeological sites that are later confirmed by excavation. The search for the underwater kingdom has been significantly advanced by modern technology that allows researchers to explore previously inaccessible environments. Higher resolution satellite imagery has revealed large-scale geometric patterns in the landscape around tonal sap that correspond to the regional planning principles described in the palace archives. These patterns, invisible from ground level, suggest that the underwater kingdom's influence extended far beyond the immediate area of the palace complex. LiDAR surveys conducted by international research teams have identified extensive underground structures throughout the region, including networks of chambers and tunnels that appear to connect various temple complexes with natural and artificial water bodies. The scale and sophistication of these underground systems suggests a level of coordinated engineering that far exceeds what conventional archaeology attributes to the period. The most recent technological advances have enabled researchers to explore the information dimension that the underwater kingdom supposedly transformed into during the last ceremony. Dr. Lisa Park of MIT's Consciousness Studies Laboratory has developed experimental protocols for accessing what she terms quantum information matrices, organized patterns of information that exist independently of any physical storage medium. Dr. Park's research involves using advanced meditation techniques combined with quantum field measurement devices to detect and decode information patterns that exist in the quantum foam underlying physical reality. Her preliminary results suggest the existence of vast information structures that appear to contain technical knowledge about consciousness manipulation, dimensional navigation, and reality management techniques. While Dr. Park's work remains highly experimental and controversial, her documented results include successful prediction of archaeological discoveries based on information obtained through these quantum access protocols. Her research team has used this approach to locate several previously unknown temple sites and to identify optimal locations for excavating underwater archaeological remains. The modern search for the underwater kingdom continues to attract seekers from around the world, drawn by the possibility that ancient wisdom about consciousness and reality might still be accessible to those who possess the proper knowledge and spiritual preparation. These contemporary seekers include scientists, artists, spiritual practitioners, and individuals from all walks of life who share a common conviction that the boundary between legend and history is more permeable than mainstream culture acknowledges. The international community of underwater kingdom researchers maintains active networks for sharing discoveries, coordinating research projects, and preserving the growing body of knowledge about this elusive civilization. Their work represents a unique collaboration between conventional academic disciplines and alternative approaches to historical research that incorporate consciousness studies, quantum physics, and experimental archaeology. As you rest in the gentle embrace of deep night, consider the courage required to seek wisdom that exists beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge, and the dedication of those who continue ancient quests for understanding that transcends the apparent limitations of time and space. Their searching lights illuminate pathways between the known and unknown, keeping alive the possibility that the greatest treasures of human achievement may still be waiting to be rediscovered in the liminal spaces where water meets earth and dreams touch reality. The eternal returning these final moments before sleep claims you completely. Our story completes its circle, returning to the eternal questions that have guided us through the mists of ancient history and the depths of hidden knowledge. The peaceful darkness that surrounds you now mirrors the primordial waters from which all stories emerge and to which they must eventually return, carrying with them the wisdom gleaned from their journey through the realms of possibility. What ultimate message did the Dragon Kings hope to preserve through their transformation into eternal information? When will the conditions be right for their knowledge to emerge once again into the physical world? Where in the modern landscape might we find the doorways that lead back to the timeless realm of the underwater kingdom? Who among contemporary seekers might possess the keys necessary to reopen communication with the consciousness entities that the Dragon Kings became? How does the circular nature of time ensure that what was lost will eventually be found, and what was dissolved will ultimately reconstitute itself in new forms? The story of the underwater kingdom is fundamentally a story about the cyclical nature of existence itself. Just as the seasons turn in eternal repetition and the waters of the Great Lake rise and fall in patterns that span decades and centuries, so too do civilizations, knowledge systems, and forms of consciousness follow cyclical patterns that operate on scales vast enough to dwarf human lifespans, yet intimate enough to touch individual hearts with their mysterious rhythms. The Dragon Kings understood this principle more deeply than perhaps any other aspect of cosmic law. Their decision to dissolve their physical kingdom rather than allow it to decay gradually reflected their recognition that preservation sometimes requires transformation, and that the most precious achievements of consciousness can only be maintained by releasing them from the limitations of particular forms and allowing them to flow into the eternal currents that connect all moments and all possibilities. The information matrix created during the last ceremony was designed not as a static repository of knowledge, but as a living system that could grow, adapt, and respond to the changing needs of future seekers. Like a vast seed scattered across the dimensions of space and time, this matrix contains within itself all the potential necessary to reconstitute the underwater kingdom's wisdom in whatever forms might be appropriate for different historical periods and cultural contexts. Contemporary researchers who have successfully accessed portions of this matrix report that the knowledge they encounter is never presented as abstract information, but always appears in forms specifically adapted to their individual backgrounds, needs, and capabilities. A scientist might receive technical specifications for advanced consciousness research equipment, while an artist might experience visions that inspire new forms of creative expression, incorporating multidimensional aesthetic principles. This adaptive quality of the preserved knowledge suggests that the Dragon Kings anticipated that their wisdom would need to manifest differently across various cultures and historical periods. the techniques for maintaining harmony between technological development and natural systems that served their aquatic civilization might need to appear as sustainable energy technologies in industrial societies, or as community organization principles in cultures facing social fragmentation. The cyclical return of the underwater kingdom's influence can be traced through patterns that span centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that knowledge derived from the dissolved kingdom has periodically emerged into human civilizations during times of particular need or opportunity, contributing to advances in hydraulic engineering, consciousness studies, and the integration of spiritual principles with practical governance. The classical Angkor period represents one such emergence, when surface civilizations gained access to sophisticated water management technologies that enabled them to support large populations in challenging environments. The temple complexes built during this period served not only as religious centers, but as technological installations for accessing and applying knowledge preserved from the underwater kingdom's information matrix. Similar periods of knowledge emergence can be identified in other Southeast Asian civilizations, including the maritime kingdoms of Java and Sumatra that developed advanced navigation techniques, incorporating both stellar astronomy and psychic sensing capabilities. The technical sophistication of these civilizations often exceeded what conventional historical analysis would predict based on their apparent technological foundations, suggesting supplementary knowledge sources that may have derived from the underwater kingdom's legacy. The modern period appears to represent another major cycle of emergence, as evidenced by the increasing number of individuals who report accessing the underwater kingdom's preserved knowledge through various consciousness exploration techniques. The development of quantum physics, consciousness studies, and ecological systems thinking in contemporary science provides conceptual frameworks that may be particularly compatible with the multidimensional knowledge that the Dragon Kings preserved. Dr. Elena Vasquez of the International Institute for Consciousness research has proposed that the current historical period represents optimal conditions for a major reconstitution of the underwater kingdom's wisdom informs appropriate for addressing contemporary global challenges. Her analysis suggests that the combination of advanced communication technologies, growing awareness of ecological interconnection, and emerging scientific understanding of consciousness creates unprecedented opportunities for accessing and applying multidimensional knowledge systems. The signs of this potential emergence can be observed in various fields, where breakthrough discoveries seem to involve knowledge that appears from sources that researchers cannot fully explain. Advances in biomimetic engineering that incorporate design principles found in no known natural systems. Developments in quantum computing that depend on theoretical insights that seem to anticipate discoveries not yet made. And innovations in sustainable technology that integrate multiple systems in ways that demonstrate understanding of ecological relationships that formal science is only beginning to recognize. Perhaps most significantly, the emergence appears to be occurring not through the efforts of individual genius researchers, but through collaborative networks that span multiple disciplines and cultures. These networks often form spontaneously among individuals who share certain types of visionary experiences or consciousness-expanding practices, suggesting that the underwater kingdom's knowledge is seeking out those who possess the spiritual preparation necessary to handle multidimensional information responsibly. The communities that form around this shared access to preserved knowledge demonstrate organizational principles that reflect the Dragon King's approach to balancing individual development with collective harmony. These groups typically operate through consensus decision-making processes that incorporate both rational analysis and intuitive insight, creating social structures that can adapt fluidly to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity of purpose. The ultimate goal of the underwater kingdom's knowledge preservation appears to be the eventual development of human civilizations that can maintain advanced technological capabilities while remaining in harmony with natural, ecological systems and the consciousness entities that inhabit multiple dimensions simultaneously. This integration would represent a return to the cosmic balance that the Dragon Kings maintained in their aquatic realm, but adapted to the specific conditions and opportunities of surface-dwelling civilizations. The prophecies preserved from the Oracle of the Floating Islands suggest that this reconstitution will not involve the physical restoration of underwater palaces or the return of Serpent Kings, but rather the emergence of new forms of human civilization that incorporate the essential principles that the underwater kingdom embodied. These future societies might develop technologies that work in partnership with natural systems rather than dominating them, governance structures that balance individual freedom with collective wisdom, and spiritual practices that maintain conscious connection with multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The timing of this emergence appears to be connected with astronomical cycles that operate on scales spanning millennia. The Dragon Kings calculated their ceremonial activities according to celestial alignments that reflected the movement of consciousness through cosmic evolutionary cycles, and their final prophecies suggested that the optimal conditions for reconstituting their wisdom would occur during specific astronomical configurations that are only now beginning to manifest. Modern astronomical observations have confirmed the existence of several cosmic cycles that correspond to time frames mentioned in the Underwater Kingdom's archived calculations. These include galactic alignment processes that affect the Earth's relationship with cosmic consciousness fields, solar system movements that influence the planet's receptivity to multidimensional information, and lunar planetary resonances that create optimal conditions for accessing quantum information. Matrices, the individuals who are currently experiencing the most dramatic forms of access to the underwater kingdom's preserved knowledge often report that their experiences intensify during specific astronomical conditions, particularly during eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and the seasonal transitions that mark the crossing points between different energy cycles. This correlation suggests that the Dragon Kings designed their information preservation system to take advantage of natural cosmic rhythms that enhance consciousness expansion and facilitate interdimensional communication. As our story draws to its close in the gentle darkness of deep night, we return to the eternal questions that have guided our journey through the realms of mystery and possibility. The underwater kingdom of the Dragon Kings may have dissolved its physical form centuries ago, but its essential wisdom continues to flow through the hidden currents that connect all levels of existence, waiting for the proper conditions to emerge once again into forms that can serve the evolving needs of consciousness in its eternal quest for understanding and harmony. The cycle is complete, yet it is also just beginning. Like the waters of the Great Lake that flow in endless circulation between earth and sky, the story of the underwater kingdom returns to its source while simultaneously reaching toward new destinations that span the infinite possibilities of space and time. In your dreams tonight, you may find yourself walking along the shores of that primordial lake where water meets earth and legends touch reality, carrying within your consciousness the seeds of ancient wisdom that await the perfect moment to bloom in the garden of tomorrow's understanding. The volume of our story fades now, as promised, diminishing gradually like mist rising from water until only silence remains a silence that is not empty but full of potential, pregnant with all the stories yet to be told and all the wisdom yet to be discovered in the eternal dance between the known and the unknown. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the twilight realms where history and legend interweave, like currents in an ancient lake. May your sleep be peaceful in your dreams, filled with the gentle flow of waters that connect all things in the vast ocean of consciousness. Rest well, and may you wake refreshed, carrying within you the quiet knowledge that the greatest mysteries are often hidden in the spaces between sleeping and waking, where the impossible becomes possible and the forgotten becomes remembered once again. Good night, and sleep well.